Scouting soybean fields in early August is important to help identify potential disease issues. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler says soybean seedling infections that happen early in the growing season are now showing up in the crop. We met with Loren in the field to learn more about these infections as well as how to identify and manage them.
Well, anytime we have really wet conditions early on, that provides a great opportunity for a lot of infection early. And some of our diseases, for example, SDS, even some of the Fusarium wilt pathogens, and others can have a latency period. And charcoal rot is a good one, for example, where early on we have wet conditions, we get some infection, and then later in the season we see that progress to what we see in that pod filling stages. So early wet conditions are really conducive for diseases, not only seedling diseases early on that affect stand, but then later in the season that we'll see. So after those wet conditions in the spring, once we have really hot conditions or dry conditions, that's really a perfect situation for charcoal rot. So any parts of the state where they were wet and then later in the season they were dry, we were seeing some charcoal rot even earlier this year. And then now we'll see that continuing to progress. The other thing that stress can do is with that heat stress, if it's dry, that stresses the plant. So then if we get a situation that right after that drought or that stress of heat, we get a heavy rain event, that's where we've seen some pretty significant Phytophthora this year. So all the points that can really stress the plant in any way, if it's stress, if it's a high availability of moisture or flooding early on, really provide courts for infection, and then we'll see that show up. Right now we're in that stem and root rot phase of soybean development. So this is when we see all the things that are, from Phytophthora to sudden death syndrome to charcoal rot, brown stem rot. Now all these will be showing up now. So critical time now to really scout those fields, because those are all also diseases that we're going to use resistance for in future years if we identify them. You can't really do anything now, but you can scout and identify and use the right resistance in the future. Yeah, so a couple things. When we're looking at stem and root rots, it is important to identify it correctly. So the biggest thing is when you pull those plants up, if it's sudden death syndrome, it's going to pull real easy. That taproot's going to be rotted off. And comparing that to brown stem rot, we really need to take that plant and split the stem to see where that discoloration is. If it's brown stem rot, there's going to be dark discoloration in the center. If it's sudden death syndrome, that discoloration is going to be in those outer layers directly under the tissues on the outside. There'll just be some streaking underneath there. So you won't see anything evident on the outside, but inside you'll see that discoloration, not in the center. If you see discoloration on the outside, there's a couple things that could be. You could have Phytophthora or root and stem rot if it's going from the soil base working its way up. If you see breaks in that discoloration and green streaks, you're probably dealing with stem canker, and we are seeing more stem canker this year. The other thing to look for right now is frog eye leaf spot. So many producers have already made their decision and sprayed if they were going to, but that's another one to watch for, because that's something that you can use resistance for in future years. Not that you're necessarily going to spray as we get into these reproductive stages. I'd really recommend that R3 or early R4 application timing. But at this point, you can really be out there scouting to know, hey, do I have something that's going to show up in residue in the following years? Really, from the disease management standpoint right now, it's really more of a watch and keep records. So identifying the things that you see in your fields, identifying how much of that field is affected. Just for example, sudden death syndrome. If you're having significant effects of that and you see, half of your field or significant amount of that field affected, maybe the next time you're in that field with soybeans, you're going to make that decision to use that additional seed treatment. But keeping records and knowing how much is really being impacted is going to be critical for future production and really to make profitable decisions.